about me, but I enjoy people watching, especially when we're at the airport. It's always very moving to see the anticipation as people wait to be reunited with their loved ones. Husbands meeting wives, children reunited with a parent, families welcoming grandparents, or friends greeting each other. There may be tears as loved ones are reunited after a long separation. This is the joy of relationships. If you've been watching the news recently, you will have seen the release of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners. Who cannot but be touched by these scenes of jubilation as the families rejoice together? It is perhaps not an exaggeration to say that relationships are the most important thing in life, because the two greatest commandments in the Bible are concerned with relationships. First, towards God, and then towards one another. We read in Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 to 39, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself." Whenever there are broken relationships, whether with God, within families, within or between nations, this is not pleasing to God. God is in the business of reconciling broken relationships. There's perhaps nothing more wonderful than witnessing the healing of a broken relationship. The message of the gospel is the message of reconciliation. As we read in the second letter of Paul to the Corinthians, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone. The new is here. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. Just as we have been forgiven, so we need to forgive those who have hurt us. This is our task as ambassadors of Christ." Our reading today from Genesis allows us to see the wonderful reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers after 22 years of separation and estrangement. It's possibly the greatest example of human forgiveness in the Bible. The story of Joseph has always been a favourite of mine, like you, Richard, since Sunday school days, and one with which I'm sure we're all familiar. A story of jealousy, attempted murder, slavery, seduction, and unjust imprisonment. The story of a slave rising to one of the most powerful positions in the house of the Pharaoh. It's also a story of forgiveness and reconciliation. Let's remind ourselves of the background to this chapter in Genesis. When Joseph was 17 years old, his 10 brothers were extremely jealous of him because he was his father's favourite son, and because they couldn't stand his dreams, which portrayed them bowing down to him. The coat of many colours, which their father Jacob had given to Joseph, was an all too obvious symbol of Joseph's special relationship with his father. He was their father's favourite. This is not a recipe for good family relationships. The brothers were so jealous that one day, when Joseph was sent by his father to look for them in the fields, the brothers made the fateful decision to put an end to Joseph and his dreams. They caught him and threw him into a pit, intending to kill him. However, a trading caravan happened to pass by, so they agreed to sell him to a slave trader for 20 pieces of silver. When they returned home, they showed their father Joseph's coat, which they had stained with goat's blood. And so Jacob believed his beloved son had been devoured by a wild animal. Of course, Joseph's trials were not to end there. He was sold to Potiphar, the captain of the Pharaoh's guard. And over time, he found favor with Potiphar and became an overseer. Unfortunately for Joseph, Potiphar's wife developed an attraction for him. And when he rejected her advances, she had him unjustly imprisoned. It was Joseph's ability to interpret dreams that would eventually save not only him, but the people of Egypt and his own family. Joseph successfully interpreted the Pharaoh's dreams, predicting 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. On Joseph's advice, the grain was stored during the plentiful times, ensuring sufficient for the years of famine that followed. Joseph was to become second in command in the Pharaoh's house, and he was now in a position to determine his brother's fate. During the famine, Joseph's brothers were sent to Egypt to buy food, and Joseph recognizes them, but they do not recognize him. Joseph tests them to see how much they have changed. He holds his youngest brother Benjamin hostage. If they're prepared to leave him to his fate, he would know they were still as wicked as before. But they refuse to leave without him and are willing to become slaves rather than abandon their brother. Joseph now reveals his true identity. He breaks down in tears and says, "I am Joseph. Is my father alive?" One can imagine how the brothers must have felt. They thought he was dead, and now here is their brother, a powerful ruler, able to determine their future. They were terrified. What would be their punishment? Much to their amazement, Joseph's words were not words of anger and revenge for everything that had happened to him, but were words of kindness and loving concern, opening the way for reconciliation. Joseph's attitude shows us the key to being reconciled to those who have hurt us. Often, it is the offended person who must take the initiative to bring about healing in relationships. Many in Joseph's position would have allowed the hurt they'd experienced to dominate their lives, becoming bitter and wanting only revenge. Joseph chose to forgive his brothers. What a difference the grace of forgiveness makes to one's relationships. What can we learn from Joseph's story? At all times, God was at the centre of Joseph's life. On revealing himself to his brothers, he says, "Do not be afraid, for I am in God's place. And as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about the present result, to preserve many people alive." He turned his gaze away from his troubles and towards God, saying that God intended it all for good. Throughout his trials, Joseph chose to surrender and trust in a higher plan. If we choose to rely on God, even in the most difficult situations, things can be made easier. Remember, as we learn in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, God causes everything to work together for good for those who love him. Of course, we're only too aware that there are divisions within and between members of the Christian faith. I recently read of a very moving example of reconciliation within the worldwide church, which is worth sharing. It's an event which some of you may recall. On March the 24th, 1966, the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Michael Ramsey, met with Pope Paul VI and together led an ecumenical liturgy in Rome's Basilica. They entered side by side and sat on the same level, close to each other. They signed a common declaration affirming their desire that all those Christians who belong to those two communions may be animated by these same sentiments of respect, esteem, and fraternal love. This marked the first meeting of the leaders of these two churches in 400 years. After the ceremony was over, Pope Paul took Ramsey aside and asked him, in his rather accented English, to remove his ring. Ramsey turned to Andrew, his private secretary, who said, "Take off your ring." Ramsey did this, handing it to Andrew. Pope Paul then took Ramsey's right hand and placed a green and gold ring with a cross in the centre and 4 diamonds around it onto his finger. Ramsey paused a moment, allowing the significance of the gesture to sink in. The Bishop of Rome was recognising him as a fellow member of the episcopate and the church he led as a sister to the Church of Rome. Ramsey burst into tears and Pope Paul reached out to embrace him. Ramsey wore the ring for the rest of his life, and it is now the custom for Archbishops of Canterbury to wear this ring when they visit the Pope. Since this historic meeting, there have been many initiatives for the two communions to work and pray together. You'll also recall the joy of reconciliation that Jesus describes in his parable of the prodigal son. We can visualize the scene in Luke 15, verse 20. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Remember too the moving scene when Peter is reconciled with his risen Lord. 3 times Jesus asks, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" Recalling the 3 times that Peter had denied him. To each response from Peter that Jesus knows that Peter loves him, Jesus responds, "Feed my sheep." Jesus not only forgives Peter, but commissions him to be a leader in the church. Reconciliation is a powerful and transformative message that God offers to all humanity. Through the cross of Christ, we can be reconciled to God and empowered to reconcile with one another. As individuals and as a church, we are called to embrace this message, extend forgiveness, and actively seek peace and unity in our relationships. Let us be a people of God, carrying the message of reconciliation into a broken world. In a divided world, our oneness is how the world will know that Jesus Christ is Lord. Amen. Let's pause.